Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. I'm here with Dr. Nick Begich, who is an expert in the area of high-frequency active auroral research program. He is the author of a new book called Controlling the Human Mind, the Technologies of Political Control, or Tools for Peak Performance. Dr. Begich also wrote Angels Don't Play This HAARP, Advances in Tesla Technology with Gene Manning, Earth Rising, The Revolution Toward 1,000 Years of Peace, and his latest book, Earth Rising 2, The Betrayal of Science, Society, and the Soul, with the late James Roderick. He's the editor of Earthpulse Flashpoints, a new science book series. He's published articles in science, politics, education. He's a very well-known lecturer. He's presented throughout the United States and in 19 countries. He's been on thousands of radio and television shows. He served as an expert witness and speaker before the European Parliament and spoken on various issues for groups representing citizens' concerns, statesmen and elected officials, scientists, and others. He's the publisher and co-owner of Earthpulse Press. We really want to welcome him today because he has spread light on a subject that is not easy to talk about, let alone to educate the public about. It's a subject that has to do with HAARP, a microwave technology that cooks the ionosphere that is missing from most climate debates, science, and conferences. Ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome to Dr. Nick Begich. Welcome to It's Rainmaking Time, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting program.
You have great courage publishing Angels Don't Play This HAARP. I would like to know what led you to do this.
Well, it was really a series of accidents, in terms of deciding to write the book and get that information out. But I'd read a short article in actually Nexus magazine about this project taking place in Alaska and being very politically oriented up here, and it's really Alaska's big geographically, small in terms of population, so you tend to pretty much keep up with what's going on around Alaska. And this was a project not getting much local attention, and when I began looking into it and began to pull the first documents and have some of my friends who are physicists take a look at the materials and other atmospheric scientists, it became clear that this was something that really needed more in-depth reporting. And that led to an article which then led to my meeting Gene and my co-author. And Gene Manning had written a book, The Coming Energy Revolution, and she has a sequel, I think, out now on that theme. And we collaborated and put together the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP, which was pretty much the expose on that project here in Alaska.
The project has been very downplayed by the PR analyst at HAARP.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, the military projects, and this is funded by DARPA these days. It used to be the Air Force and Navy's project. DARPA took it over a few years ago. But essentially they fund military projects, research, and applications, and that's what HAARP is really about. When you look at the original planning documents, and we knew the inventor quite well. In fact, I got to know him quite well over the last 14 years, up until his death in 2007. In fact, he was an attendee at one of our conferences when I was working with the Lay Institute out of Dallas.
What's his name?
That's Bernard Eastland, the inventor. And Eastland was, understood what he had, and what happened as he, progressed from, the 80s when the concept was originated to today, a lot has changed. I mean, that's like the horse and buggy compared to where we are, because things change so rapidly in this area that his latest research indicated that, for instance, in the weather modification applications of HAARP, he figured you could do it with 1,600 times less energy than he originally thought was necessary when he designed HAARP. So, those kinds of changes in base knowledge really changed to the dimension of the project, much along the same lines as we laid out in 1995 when we published the first version of the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP.
Didn't Nikola Tesla really invent this technology? Could you explain it to the public, establish the frame of reference, and connect it in how Tesla's technology is being either used or misused inside this HAARP technology?
Well, Tesla, of course, most people or many people know who he is today, and he was the inventor of the AC current and transmission system, generation system, AC motors. I mean, the things we rely on every day for the electricity that we get. Edison's given all kinds of credit, and he developed the uses of DC current and the light bulb, and those are all important, but alternating current was the real key. And he also had a number of ideas in terms of use of radio frequency energy and other forms of energy in terms of weapons technology. And so Tesla had some pretty exotic ideas there that he continued to pitch to the government, and developed some patent concepts, and was lecturing about these weapons of invisible rays that would strike like bolts of lightning from Thor, is how he described in one article. But the point is, he was brilliant in this area, and in the original patents by Eastland, actually some of that work was cited by Eastland, and Eastland saw sort of the stimulus creatively for looking at this concept came from those papers and ideas of Tesla. And Eastland was a brilliant plasma physicist, where energy takes mass and form, and that was his big deal. If you look at his patents, although he did a lot of work in oil and gas, if you really look at his patent, a lot of them deal with his specialty in plasma physics. And I guess that's really the correlation, in terms of that impetus. And some of the ideas that Eastland had with these HAARP transmitters, which right now HAARP is 180 72-foot tall antennas with what's called a cross dipole, which would look like just like you would expect. It would look like the positive sign, the plus sign, perpendicular to the ground. So, and those are like 60 feet across. So there's a big field of 180 of these in a specific array, and when you fire them or shoot radio frequency energy out of them, you can create what's called cyclotron resonance, which, if you could visualize this.
Let's say that again. It's called cyclotron resonance.
Right, and it would be visually like a corkscrewing kind of motion of energy coming off of this array, getting smaller and smaller as it went higher and higher, and eventually, it hits a strike point in the ionosphere where the radio frequency energy is concentrated. And that's kind of the opposite of what normally happens with radio frequency energy coming off an antenna. Think about a funnel with the small end at the antenna with energy is concentrated, and then it spreads out and gets less and less concentrated or dense as it goes away. So the further you get from the antenna, the less effect. In this case, it's operating by analogy like a laser, where laser concentrates the light, because laser does the same thing. A normal flashlight shining against a wall gets wide real rapidly and dissipates till it's no longer effective at a pretty short distance. Laser concentrates, focuses the energy into a narrow beam, and it carries across a large distance, and stays relatively compact. And the same idea is with this case, with radio frequency, being able to focus it. That's what gives HAARP its unique characteristic, number one, and then the idea that you can pulse it or shape it or modify it in lots of different ways within milliseconds. It allows you to do some pretty exotic things, and that's where Eastland, the inventor, this original concept sort of came from. And the thing about it is you need a lot of energy to run it, and the ideal source of energy is natural gas, and the ideal location of a device like this is close to the polar regions of the Earth where the magnetic field lines of the Earth intersect it, because in some instances they actually pump energy into those field lines and utilize them as a carrier to create a number of weapons applications. So HAARP is located where it is because Alaska happens to have probably the largest untapped sources of natural gas in the U.S., and huge basins of gas that will one day come to market. But the idea was here they could build these facilities in a location where they might not even have to transport it. They just take the gas out of the ground, run it into magnetohydrodynamic generators, which was the original concept, which produce in a compact area very efficiently huge amounts of energy. And that's sort of the original idea behind sort of HAARP and why it was located where it was and so on.
But is that really what it's there for?
Oh, no.
What is its purpose?
Several applications. Over-the-horizon radar is one of them, being able to look over the horizon for incoming aircraft and so on. Being able to distinguish, what's coming in is one of the other attributes of the system. You can create an energy field around each of those objects, and each of them that carry a nuclear payload produce a different kind of signature that you can then, with gamma ray detectors on satellites, actually figure out which ones carry nuclear payloads, which is incredibly valuable, militarily valuable thing. And then thirdly, along that same line, you can create a EMP, an electromagnetic pulse or a surge of energy that knocks out the electronics of those incoming craft, causing them to malfunction and crash. So you can detect them. Also in that detection, you can get down to cruise missile heights. So you can get very, very low elevations or all the way up to intercontinental ballistic missile heights, which are, coming in literally from outer space. So, that versatility in just those applications was interesting to the military. But then they discovered they could also do Earth-penetrating tomography, which in simple language is like, by analogy again, would be like X-raying the Earth or looking into the Earth and imaging using radio frequency energy in this case, extremely low frequency energy that penetrates the Earth in sea with an ELF, an extremely low frequency wave, that then a certain amount of that energy is reflected and can be read for locating underground shelters, nuclear facilities. Can also be used for determining oil and gas structures and other metals and mineral structures based on how the reflected signal comes back to the surface. And this is because a certain portion of it does, and the rest just kind of passes through. And that was one of the big applications. And the same type of technology is used for communicating with submarines when they're down really deep. Shorter wavelengths don't penetrate the Earth and sea efficiently enough to reach those submarines. So they have to use an extremely low frequency signal that'll penetrate, which, the old days they used to, and they still do, create them with 13 to 26 mile long antennas in Wisconsin and other places around the world that allow them that ability to do it. In this case, they could alter the ionosphere, change it from DC to AC, like Tesla. Only in this case, the return signal is coherent. It's rhythmic. It's pulsed at a specific frequency for a specific effect. And so we take the ionosphere with a small instrument on the ground that concentrates radio frequency energy, and we alter the ionosphere in this instance to act as an antenna, a broadcast antenna in the sky, replacing those that previously and currently are in the ground. So that application came out of the original patents. That one presents some other issues dealing with human health because of the frequency ranges it operates in. But then moving on to the rest of the military applications included weather modification. The early days, the model was different in terms of how Ben looked at it. Dr. Eason looked at it, but in his last sort of visualization, how that would work, it'd be through the manipulation of gravitational waves, which ultimately affect weather in his model of the world and sort of how it operates. And those are just some of the applications that immediately pop out of the literature as you relate to HAARP.
So, in a sense, this is very important to the military-industrial complex and to the paradigm on security and for what they translate as the real security.
Yeah, because in how they view it, absolutely. And the other issue is that there's some environmental possibilities that are kind of interesting, and then the energy, and there's also an energy transfer technology, the idea of beaming energy up into the ionosphere, reflecting it back to the Earth in such a way that it could be reconfigured into electric without transmission lines. And that goes back to some of Tesla's concepts. So I think his were a little different in form and content, because at the same time you beam energy around. If you get in between that beam and its energy source, you've got a real problem if you're in any kind of sophisticated aircraft or a satellite. And anti-satellite applications were part of this under a couple of different models, but those things of course are strategic. If you can knock a satellite out, you really can eliminate modern communications, at least a good chunk of it in one big sweep. And those kinds of uses, everyone can see. The environmental, being able to create chemical reactions in the upper atmosphere, things that would replenish, for instance, ozone or knock out specific pollutants. That's an application that's on a very slow and careful, open basis might be worth taking a look at some point. But, I think those are things that didn't really come out so much. They came out in the patents and his later work as well, but not so much in terms of military uses. When quizzed on this, and the military was, when they were a little more open, on CBC TV, they made some statements, and we found one of their technical reports that actually laid out the direction of the research in terms of weather modification.
How dangerous or violent is this technology when it's altering the ionosphere, impacts on flying, on radiation, on human health, on how much radiation then comes into the Earth? If it's altering or cooking the ionosphere and blowing holes in the ionosphere, what's the relevance of that?
Well, like for instance, in one application for anti-satellite, you create a heating situation where you push up like a column, so you're pushing through maybe several hundred miles of ionosphere, and what happens is atmosphere moves into that space, and as it does, when you hit a satellite trajectory, a low orbiting satellite as an example, and it runs into that layer of thin atmosphere that shouldn't be there, it creates friction, it burns up essentially, and you flip the device off and the satellite's no longer functional, and you got plausible deniability. But at the same time, you allow radiation to come into the Earth. The ionosphere is a shield that protects us from various particle streams coming off the sun and from outer space that would make life impossible here. That would literally alter the genetic footprint to the point of extinction. That's why the ionosphere is important, and why in these uses we're concerned, and the health implications that are obvious. The other is in the ELF range, where they're using it for earth penetrating tomography and some of these other applications. What needs to be recognized, there are window frequencies that affect human behavior and health, based upon how our bodies and minds and systems as living organisms react to energy, even weak, extremely weak energy fields, if they're coherent, rhythmic signals, not like what nature does. I mean, nature creates signals that are kind of all over the map, and most of that is, not even, does not negatively affect health or our basic condition. But man-made rhythmic signals, well, they may, carry a tune via the radio. Certain signals have a profound effect on human health and even our psyches, and that's really the direction that our work took. And I can say this about the HAARP relationship to that, is in the ELF range, the brain actually entrains to certain ELF signals and begins to follow them, mirror them, or what's called a frequency following response in the literature. And what happens is, in these ranges, you can literally change the emotional state of huge segments of the population. And we documented very carefully and thoroughly, sort of the sources for that and the basic research for that. And in fact, between the two books, I think there's probably 700-800 sources cited that really lay the foundation for where the technology has gone and why we need to be concerned. And this particular area really concerns me greatly. In fact, after the HAARP story, we continue to research that issue of just what is possible. And this area of manipulation has grown in complexity, and the RFPs and the requests for proposals by government in this area continue. And so we document quite a bit of that in our latest book, Controlling the Human Mind. And then we have a lot of backup additional documentation located at the Earthpulse website. At
earthpulse.com?
Yeah, that's it. And, and we have a whole section on mind effects there, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of pages. There's also some of the early analysis of Soviet work in the areas of parapsychology, or what they used to call paraphysics.
This is very scary, and quite frankly, I've known about HAARP for many years, and I've done about 8 shows on climate and weather, and I just find it interesting that this technology, and correct me if I'm incorrect, that fires multi-billion watt radio frequency beams into the atmosphere?
Well, the way it's effective radiated power is how it's termed, and it's like a one-page formula for how that's expressed. But essentially, it's the concentrating effect, and it is. It's the transmitter will have an effective radiated power when they finish their next phase of about 1 billion watts, and it's about half that now. And this is effective radiated power, which is the amount of energy and its relationship at the point of discharge. At the point where you're striking the effect, which is the ionosphere in this case. And here's something else that needs to be considered in conjunction with that, is there's an amplification effect. What was found at one point in the very low frequency ranges, there was sort of a triggering effect, almost like a primer on a bullet. The primer is that little explosion that releases the bigger explosion. And in this case, the bigger explosion was in the ionosphere, and this coherent signal actually caused the signal to amplify once it arrived there 1,000 times and create a virtual particle rain in Antarctica, because these particles follow those magnetic field lines. And just the way this whole thing unfolded, startled everyone, because they didn't expect that, number one. And that creates even bigger implications for an antenna array on the ground that has the ability to sweep the spectrum for 16 decades, from very low frequency, extremely low frequency, all the way up to visible light, in terms of being able to create effects in the upper atmosphere and ionosphere.
Did you say for 16 decades?
Yes, that's the bandwidth, if you will.
So you meant decades as a part of bandwidth, not time.
Right.
Okay.
And that bandwidth is extraordinary. It's virtually everything we rely on for communication, which was another possibility in use of the system, is the ability to carry your communications. Because think about it, you can sweep all the spectrum and literally disrupt everyone else's, but because you're doing the disrupting, you can also put a signal on what you're carrying and carry your own communications effectively. So, when you think about, again, military applications of a technology, it's pretty extraordinary what's being learned from this developmental prototype in Alaska. And it goes back to the early Soviet research, where the people may remember the woodpecker signal in the early 70s, and was attributed to these transmitters back in the former Soviet Union. It turns out those were the predecessors, the first ionospheric heaters ever made. And they were attributed with all kinds of things, from creating power failures, which is another thing that is potential with HAARP, because you can create, again, manipulating the energy that's really, think about it like plugging into the energy dynamo of the Earth when you think about HAARP in some of its applications. So you got the plug isn't where the power is, but it certainly gets it to what it needs to do.
And it can mimic the effect of the sun?
You're essentially tapping that, because that's the source of energy for the ionosphere and the magnetosphere around it, is the interrelationship between the energy incoming from the sun and the rotation of the planet, as a big magnet. Or if you think about what an alternating motor is, it's a magnet spinning at a rapid speed, and it's the same kind of idea. And this is where you link back to some of these big concepts of the thinkers like Tesla, and those that followed him and preceded him. That you end up with things like HAARP.
Didn't Tesla just have a vision of energy being free and available without electricity as we know it?
Yeah, and that was through principles of resonance, where we would really tap the dynamo of the planet in a way that would allow us to literally pull the energy that the planet generates. And this is where if you look at Tesla's work, the whole of his work, and I have all of his patents here, and I have all of his lectures in English.
You have all of his patents there?
Yeah.
I noticed that Raytheon owns some of his patents.
Well, all of Tesla's patents are long expired, but in terms of Eastland's work, yes, they have that, and some of those patents are due to expire, in not too distant future, just based on the 17-year patent laws in the U.S. Some of those go back to the 1980s.
That should be open source. Do you know that?
Yeah, and some of it is, but the files ought to be open now, and except what they've classified, of course, and who knows how much of that material is really available. the Eastland family is doing quite a bit now, and plan to do more release, I think, of Dr. Eastland's work. So we'll look for that in the future too. I think that'll be a good thing for keeping this discussion and debate alive. And it's amazing. In 15 years on the topic, it continues to bubble in and out of the news. And political groups, at least out of the United States, have actively been working on it. European Parliament, some of the parliaments in Europe have their own legislation on these kinds of issues. And, so in that sense, I think a lot's happened. But at the same time, the risks associated with this technology are what concerns me. And, it's the, just trust us. And I think we've all been, anyone who's got any gray hair at all has enough historical knowledge of what's happened in this country to say the only trust the government deserves is trust people are willing to give it, and we give it too much too often.
Well, this part of technology that's used by the military-industrial complex and by the military, this is such high-level technology. It's so advanced, and it's so dangerous. I cannot imagine that it isn't already altering the radiation levels on this Earth.
Well, I think there's been certain levels of experiments, but HAARP is not on all the time. It's used intermittently. But I would say these kinds of systems, and there are several transmitters now around the world. And
that's what I heard. Where are they located?
You have across Canada, there's a number of transmitters. The ISACAT system in Europe, which includes Tromsø, Norway, a number of other cooperating countries there.
Did you say Norway?
Yeah. And then you have the old Soviet transmitters, which some of those are still probably used experimentally, but certainly they exist. And then you have Arecibo, Puerto Rico, and the Chinese have actually announced sort of some research in this direction as well. So, there's quite a few. The idea of weather modification, not just through HAARP, but through many other technologies, have been talked about in Chinese military journals, Russian journals for years, and our own. And the work in this area across several fronts has advanced to the point where people are actively experimenting or manipulating weather in one region for their benefit. And there's very little restriction on this. In fact, the only international treaty on environmental manipulation, like most treaties, exempt what you do in your own territory, within your own sovereign region. And so, weather doesn't respect artificial lines drawn on a map, number one, and this is where the area becomes important. And that treaty goes back to 1977. That's 32 years ago.
What treaty are you referring to?
It's an international environmental treaty where we agreed not to use weather modification or other forms of geophysical manipulation as weapons of war. And this treaty was signed by us in 1977. It's referenced within the Angels Don't Play This HAARP book.
Okay.
But the point is the science has changed, and it was Cheney and Rumsfeld were calling for the abandonment of that treaty before those guys disappeared from the scene, on the basis that our technology advanced so much that we really needed to use it, which was sort of their view of the world anyway. Anything that would work, they wanted to use, regardless of the consequences. And I think those treaties were thought out then for obvious reasons, and today they really need to be revisited because the technologies have changed in a number of areas. It was the last Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, and we cited this in the book Earth Rising, the Revolution. He was lecturing back in 1997 at the University of Georgia, and I'm pulling his quote now as we're talking about it. And what he was talking about were technologies that could, do the kinds of things in terms of geophysical manipulation.
Are you talking about direct energy weapons?
Yes, and what he said is, and I quote, "Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climate, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves," unquote. And that was a DoD news briefing of Secretary of Defense William Cohen back April 28, 1997. He was lecturing on terrorism and weapons of mass destruction with Senator Lugers and Nunn. And to make that assertion about terrorist states tells you the state of the technology. It's because terrorist states aren't known for high science, number one, and the components that are required are essentially, off the shelf. So I think we do need to be concerned. These are the very concepts that Tesla was concerned about, when he started making his breakthroughs. Hey, you could do all this stuff. He made the assertion you could cause the earth to ring like a bell and, create a earthquake of unbelievable magnitude. But these kinds of ideas, as they're being advanced by military planners, the thing is you don't see them. They're not like a bomb going off. You can create these kinds of events and have absolute plausible deniability unless your adversary has the same technology and can run the right instruments to detect the signals.
So is that part of what's going on, that once the technology has been out there and it's already being used by the United States, or it's being used by Russia, and it's being used by Norway, and now it's in Europe, and in other words, it's now, quote, fair game. So now it's going on not just here, but it's going on internationally, the same type of abuses to the ionosphere. How can anybody have a climate change conversation and say, yes, it may be humans involved, but this is the humanity that's involved?
Well, it could very well be. And the reality, when you look at contributors to greenhouse gases, 97 to 99% of that is natural, and only 1% is man-made. And natural in the form of decaying plant matter and organic matter, as well as volcanic eruption and all the things that contribute to greenhouse gases.
Sure.
Man doesn't contribute the vast majority. Shut off everything man does, nature can mess it up with one variance in its normal cycle.
What do you have to say about the fact that this technology is in many parts of the world and is occurring, and there's no discussion of it on a global level about how it's not only altering weather and can alter weather as a weapon, but it is cooking and it is ruining a protective shield that we need on this earth for living well?
Yeah, well, at a minimum, it's producing a risk that the world, no one has franchise on. The world needs to be involved in assessing that risk in the open light of day and eliminating unnecessary challenges. For instance, if you could figure it out someday, and we're way, way, way away from that day, but if you could figure it out and manipulate geophysical factors with clear understanding of all of the side consequences and be able to for instance, solve the ozone issues if those are truly issues, solve the pollutant issues if they're truly issues, and moderate temperature, well, that's all interesting, but we're in kindergarten with a hand grenade, and it's being done by a military and an academic complex, and not in the open light of day, but in a very different kind of model.
Yeah, the paradigm is that Earth is their lab.
Yeah, exactly right. In fact, they've said it. It's like a plasma lab in the sky. In Eastland, on the weather modification stuff he was doing at the end of his life in the last several years, he viewed it as he wasn't giving any of it to the military. His view of it was, if this was ever going anywhere, it was going to happen in the open light of day with a whole lot of people involved and absolute open science, or he wasn't participating. And, he had plenty of options in his life. Really brilliant people do. And my relationship with Eastland was a good one. And I got to say, he was a very ethical guy, and he had certain ideas that had absolute positive implications, and others that he looked at as having positive and negative applications and had to be looked at very carefully, if at all. In fact, he did a lecture. We have it posted on our website. It's free, and people can go there and download it and look at it. It's about an hour of Eastland talking about some of his big picture concepts and in terms of positive, negative applications and uses. And and I think he had some really brilliant ideas in several fronts, not just in this area, but the risks also he began to understand. And what he said to me, and he began to publish in all of his material, is because we never created a villain out of him. We looked at him as, hey, he's a scientist doing what he thinks is great work, and it is in his field, but without necessarily understanding the implications within other fields. And and that was his eye opener, was that we really needed more multidisciplinary approaches to science to make sure what we're doing in one field doesn't in fact affect something else in some contrary way. In the case of HAARP, it's the energy signals that can override signals within our minds and within our bodies that can cause, on a very large scale, serious issues. either deliberately or as a side effect. And in either case, those of us who become the experimental subjects at least need to weigh in.
This actually can alter subatomic particles, too.
Yes. I mean, we're
Totally.
talking about manipulating energy at its essence and causing, changes, that are quite profound on several different levels. And this is, again, why today, and I think that's where we continued the work in the Earth Rising series, which are about mixed technologies, and then later controlling the human mind, which we consider to be, the realm of neuroscience and what's happening there. As science sort of merges, you have computer science and biological sciences and other sciences merging in a way that is unprecedented in at least our understanding of human history. And as a consequence, the rate of change. Every bit of technology from the invention of the wheel to where we are at this moment is going to double in about 9 months. And continue to double at that rate and a shortening rate.
You remind me of Ray Kurzweil with the law of accelerating returns.
Well, and it's what happens. And so at that rate of change, very little gets looked at properly, at least in its full context before the next thing. I mean, you go from theoretical science to a product on the shelf in a year, whereas in the old days it was 100 years, to get a concept to even move forward enough to make it into a reality. On that level. And so, that kind of acceleration, that kind of change, and even shorter, if you're really bent on, getting something out and getting an understanding, that's a big deal. And that's why this kind of science, when we're talking about literally plugging into the environment itself and using it as part of your machine, that should have a little more discussion. I think most of us on the planet recognize the infancy of science and the change of science. Scientific models about every 50 years in the last 500 have had some dramatic changes, and particularly in the last couple hundred. Since academics have ruled the roost in terms of what are considered creative and inventive, as opposed to just sort of coming from wherever it came from.
How do you protect yourself from radiation around you with antennas for cell stations?
You don't. The main thing is to maintain strong physiological systems, our own health, the diets we take in, the things we do to degrade our immune systems, all of these things that weaken us, weaken our coherence, if you will. Fear and anxiety. I mean, if you look at brainwave activity in those states, it's incoherent brain patterns that you get. If you look in any of the higher states of consciousness, those signals are quite coherent, rhythmic, types of signals that sort of slow down, create a very strong physiological body that actually has an electrical component that can be measured in a number of different ways. And so healthy systems, most of these signals are weak at a distance, which means your body will gravitate to the stronger signal. It will ignore it as background noise in many cases. Strong signals close in are more difficult to deal with. So that's the power grid that surrounds you, the cell phones you stick next to your head. These you can't do much about except avoid them or take control of them in a more deliberate way.
What do you do?
Well, I don't use a cell phone, number one. As busy as I am, I've gotten through 51 years without having to have one. With the one exception, if I travel to lecture, I get one of those pay-as-you-go phones for my daughters to reach me in case they have a problem. But besides that, I don't use them. And most things don't require such an emergency as I can't wait to call at a landline, and I've structured my life accordingly. When you think about the power grid itself, it's pretty much unavoidable. You do things to maintain your own health. And if people who've met my wife and I, we're in our 50s, and most people think we're in our 30s. So, we live a healthy life and have strong systems from it. But the other part of it is where we live. Our water, if you measure our water for pH and for microvolts, it's a minus 60 microvolts and a pH of about 7.7, 7.8, which is extraordinary for,
Wow.
And I've measured much better water than that in our region. And we don't take the sun in the dosages most people do. In the winter, right now, we're down to 6 hours. In the summer, we take a pretty good hit, but most people, given our lifestyles, aren't out in it, that much. So, sun radiation is minimal. for a good part of the year, and just by lifestyles that all of us have in urban areas these days.
How has Angels Don't Play This HAARP been received?
Pretty well. I mean, it's created some things happening in Europe. Most of the work on this issue in terms of legislation you can trace back to our publications and our testimonies that we've given all over the world. So I think it's done what it needed to do. I mean, that was why we wrote it. We wanted to get the issue out, and the fact that it continues to be an issue and will continue to be an issue until there's a solution. I think as time has gone on, we've been proven right. 15 years in print, and no one has adequately disputed what we've put on the record, and that's the point. And I think we followed that rule for 15 years on all of the issues that we've produced material on. As a consequence, we've made progress in legislative arenas and other arenas on getting a lot of these issues addressed.
What is a direct energy weapon?
Essentially, think about it in terms of, it's pretty self-expressed, but it's the idea of being able to utilize energy as opposed to bullets and bombs and the standard kinds of ordnance that we think about when we think about warfare. Directed energy weapons follow the same line of destruction, but a different line of thinking, and they cover an array from things that just disrupt electronic circuits to things that override the human senses. In fact, there's a technology horizons put out by the Air Force, published in June of 2004, an article on controlled effects using directed energy weapons that would have sort of 3 tiers of effect, from altering computer circuits to melting computer circuits, or affecting first software, being able to disrupt the data flow, taking in little manipulations so that the data doesn't come through computer systems adequately or accurately, causing all kinds of problems with modern technology, to actual destruction of hardware through melting or enough energy to create that kind of change. And then the third aspect was manipulation of the human operator, and that was through being able to override any of the 5 senses, and that's where the technological research has gone, to override the 5 senses in a way that could create complete hallucinogenic effect in terms of how you perceive reality, but using energy as the vehicle as opposed to chemical means.
Wasn't the original direct energy weaponry called scalar out of Russia?
Well, some people say that. I think the original technology was Nikola Tesla in 1880. A lot of that type and that line of research was much different than our own. Ours took it as through compartmentalization. We took all these guys that were specialists, put them all in a closet somewhere, and expected somehow to bridge that communication effectively to create weapons. And we did. And that was the amazing thing, that model worked, because the cost of doing that were many, many, many times what the cost of Russian research was to get to the same place, and they did it in the opposite way. They teamed multidisciplinary teams across all the branches of science to come up with their think tank approaches, and as a result, they got integrated thinking, which gave them a distinct advantage in terms of cost, because it's a very cost-effective way to do it, and secondly, in results, because they understood these concepts on human physiology, I would say, before we really grasp it in the modern frame. And we played catch-up, because the Russians were bombarding, during the Nixon administration, the U.S. Embassy with microwave discharges that we thought were some kind of an eavesdropping device, until we tested the same signals, because we could measure them. We knew what they were doing, we knew how it was running. We just didn't know what they were doing until we did it against primates, and they still have that report classified because of the effects. And then they gave everybody health incentives, bonuses, if you will, to stay and work in the Russian embassy. But the point is, now we know from modern research what they found out, that was making those people sick and psychotic. And that was the plan. And so we learned a lot. The Russians learned it a little bit before us in the modern term, but that was a time, if you go back to the MK Ultra and early experiments in mind control that were eventually revealed in the U.S. Congress in the Church Committee hearings back in the early 70s, most of it went to chemical hallucinogenics of various kinds, and they did all that research. But the other was sort of looking at other ways to override the mind, including use of electromagnetic fields and other field effects. But what they discovered, and I think this is really my bigger conclusion about, those mind control experiments, and you hear about them in a lot of different venues, and they've been reported on for, many decades since. But it's always about controlling people. That's what everybody gets hung up on, is that isn't what they discovered that was so important. I mean, obviously, those things were important at a certain level, but what they discovered, and what also shows up in literature, is sort of the anomalous capabilities of human minds when they are triggered or stimulated in certain ways to create some effects that can't be explained very well, or certainly couldn't then. Those are the things, the potential of human consciousness that resides within every living soul that they discovered that scared the hell out of them. And keeping people from reaching those states is what really, if you look around, if you're in a state of fear or anxiety, and most people live there. Most people in the United States and in modern cultures and other primitive cultures, for that matter, that have been impacted by Western thinking, live in a certain level of low-level anxiety and fear. Vast majority of the population.
And I'm sure after hearing this, we'll be in more fear.
Well, that's the thing to let go of, is because the reality...
It's already going on. It's been going on.
Yeah, and what's the solution, is the question a lot of people are asking.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, actually. What do you suggest?
I think there's two lines of approach, and the more I've been in this, the longer I'm convinced that it is true. Is I still believe that there's some political solutions. It may not be found in the U.S. because our system's still pretty corrupted in terms of just how to get through it. And there's very little. I mean, if you think about the average knowledge of science in terms of the population in the United States, it's unfortunate, but it is the sad truth that it is weak. In the Congress, it's even weak. Look at how many scientists are in the Congress that can even go into a closed hearing with military technicians and even understand what the heck they're talking about. There's 2 or 3 maybe in the Senate that have some science background, and maybe 2 or 3 in the House. In a modern world where science technology decide which governments are powerful and strong, and in a democratic republic like ours...
Wait, did you say democratic republic? Is that what we're living in?
Well, it's not functioning that way so much. And, the thing about all of it is, when you look at it, that engagement, the political engagement needs to continue, and I think there's good things and bad times, and that's one of them, is people get real politically motivated when unemployment is hitting 10% officially, and probably twice that unofficially.
I was going to say probably twice, or maybe more.
And maybe more in underemployment, where people have lost good-paying jobs and are now in minimum wage jobs and count for employed. And that's probably another 20% on top of things. When you look at all of that right now in the current framework, politics is going to be it means more to people when we're suffering than when we're doing well. So hopefully more political engagement. The second issue deals with ourselves, and the other opportunity, I think, in bad times is sort of a little bit of self-examination, and that may lead us a different place, and an opportunity might be in the bad news, I guess I could say. And I think we need to change the way we think about ourselves. And the other thing, I think the good news coming out of some of this is the anomalous human capabilities, and what people in very high places are thinking about that. In fact, there's Rosalie Bertell, who's well known for her work in human radiation work. She was a mathematics professor at Stanford and a physicist, and has incredible... she's a lead physician for the WHO, going into Bhopal to see what the heck happened there, to do the initial medical reviews. And just a lot of experience. She did a thing for us, and it was, again, on our Mind conference. And we've got the videos are free at earthpulse.com. And you'll see them under Mind Effects. And Rosalie Bertell's was basically on sort of the next jump in human evolution, which, in her view, was being able to reach these higher states of awareness at will. And the things we used to call ESP, now military calls anomalous human capabilities, That's our birthright. That's who we are as human beings. We let go of our belief systems in the right way to capture some of that. We can be a lot more powerful as human beings individually. And I think that's...
Absolutely.
And that's where I think the real solution ultimately lies in all this. Not in the generation of fear, but in the generation of recognition that these things are going on, yet we are not helpless, but we do need to do some work. And so at all levels, a lot of people are doing that, I think, and I think it's important to continue to push that envelope in the right ways, both politically and internally with who we are. And in all of the bad news, I think anyone who has been around very long, the most we ever learn is in the bad news, unfortunately. It's sort of human nature. The bad news is it gets us awake and aware and maybe moves us along a better path. And that's what I would say is the best opportunity. The other is recognize you don't need some group to do it. Doing anything, doing something that people believe in to be right and true, and acting on that is the powerful aspect of human nature. And we all have a sphere of influence. We all have an issue important to us. Doing something about it on a regular, planned, and periodic basis is what's relevant. Not looking for a group to do it for you. There's a lot of things we can do individually, and others are oriented that way, and that's good too. But do something. And that's, I think, the ultimate challenge for all of us, is to act on, and that's the act of faith, in my view, is acting on what we know to be right and true, and trying to do a little something, whether it's talking to your neighbor, writing a letter to the editor, calling a congressman, or changing some aspect of your own behavior that might contribute to a better good. And that's it. That's as simple as it gets. And that's all we're ever asked to do, I think, in this life.
What are your days like in the day-to-day now?
I'm busy. I do a lot of different things. So, I'm involved, of course. I continue to do radio on the topics that interest me and independent research. But, I work with tribal governments here and as a consultant on a number of projects recently, mostly in the energy areas, which has been, uniquely educational for me on a lot of fronts, and then there are issues I'm concerned about on others. So, I continue to do that work and following the economic trends and issues. We spend a lot more time on that these days.
Do you think that there will ever be legislation attempting to stop the use of HAARP technology?
Well, in Europe, that stuff is moving forward, and there's people seriously taking it on in terms of treaty dialogue. So there's, at a level, there's discussion happening now that will continue to happen because the story won't go away, and the information is out there, and there's enough documentation where denials don't work so much anymore in those circles. So I think eventually we'll see that. I think as long as people continue to raise these kinds of issues, we'll see progress in a different direction. And ultimately, the thing about science today, and has always been true, the most profound of invention doesn't come out of academic military complex. It comes out of some guy in a closet, with a handful of tools. And I think that's, again, in this century, we're going to see the same kinds of breakthroughs, and don't expect them from the standard normal places. And then what we do with those and how they're presented, and how they move into this reality will be very interesting. And think about alternate energy.
That's ultimately where the action is once something is discovered or created, it's the entire business of bringing it into the world, which has its legal communication, whether you're in the radar, over the radar, how you protect the pioneers and the inventors while the process is going on, how you bring it to the world so it's not obstructed and defiled and stopped before it can get to the people it can contribute to. That's the business I've been in for 25 years. And
I think there's a lot of ways, to do it. It's going to take a different kind of thinking, and I think that's going to happen. But it's also going to take the stripping away of a whole lot of old institutions to change the way things are rolling. And I think in the sort of the things we have yet to face, and people think they've been through some rough times, I think what we will see in the future is going to be even more difficult. But having said that, the opportunities with what man knows and the resources that we have, we don't have to settle for that. And I think that's what's missed in a lot of discussions. It's why we've been focusing a lot on some of the economic issues, things that generate fear, and saying, hey, look, let's look at it a little differently. And technologies are the same. I mean, you think about the technologies and the things that they've have changed for us, but sort of reorienting them a little bit differently and creating less dependencies. Because, see, modern economic models for businesses are to create dependency, so you keep coming back to buy some more, not the opposite. And this is a big change that has to take place as well. It's how we look at the making of money, in terms of capitalism. And I think capitalism is a good thing, but totally unrestrained, you get things like what you get in Russia when they don't know what's going on, or China. And there's huge abuses and a high price to pay for a renegade system. And what we need is one that has a platform of values. Capitalism, you can put some values on top of capitalism, make it work a lot more effectively. But changing the model to one of how do we create the greatest level of independence? Now that would be interesting.
That would be very interesting.
Just from the standpoint of energy alone. If you had an independent source of your power and your heat, in my part of the world, and I'm not in a house that's more than a couple thousand square feet, it's $1,000 a month for energy. Well, that justifies a big amount of money I could spend on an alternative. And most people, when they start adding up, what they spend on alternatives, as they advance and become more and more feasible economically, energy should be going the opposite direction. It should be getting cheaper.
Exactly. Not
more expensive. And this is, again, and to get more and more and higher degrees of independence where you need to use less of it from someone else. We used to be independent people. Americans and people around the world used to be able to grow your own food, build your own house, make your own way, and even become a lawyer by reading just a couple of books instead of 2 floors of them. And the thing that we've done is made some things that should be simplified, very complex, created not independent systems that build the strength of who we individually are, but just the opposite. And that's where we've missed the boat, because if we look at sort of the system that's evolved, it started out with the right ideals, but there weren't enough checks and balances. And in a modern society where technology drives so much of those checks and balances, they're not there. And in terms of just personal privacy, you used to think about it, people couldn't come in your home, they couldn't come through your doorway. Well, it's not your home anymore. It's your digital doorway where your privacy is either lost or gained. And who owns your information about you? I say you do.
I say you do. And your medical information.
Absolutely. All your information, your credit card charges, your bank statements, your buying patterns, all that belongs to us. We need a reform of privacy to reflect the digital doorway. All of that information should be absolutely destroyed every 6 months unless you authorize it to be extended. Or it's a settled lawsuit decision. But the basic information about you as you develop it, your buying patterns, that kind of thing, your phone calls and who you call, when you call, where you call. After they're done billing and the period for disputing the bill has expired, the data should go away. And it doesn't. It's retained because it's valuable. It's sold and traded like meat in the market. And it's no different than someone kicking in your doorway and going through your paperwork. And we just need to think about it differently. And that's where, again, politics matters, because
and
congressmen understand that. I mean, that's obvious.
Say that again.
I think it matters. Politics matters, because when you start talking about personal privacy and what happens when it's abused, the leadership can recognize the basics of it. But again, when you're the abuser, when government has created systems that actually exploit our own vulnerability and take advantage of a lack of privacy, having data allows you the ability, and this was a big issue for us in Europe, and we dealt with it in Earthrising the Revolution and its follow-on Earthrising 2, was personal privacy-related technologies. As they've advanced, you have no presumption of privacy anywhere, anytime, anymore, because of the state of technology today and the state of the law that allows for it to be abused.
Did you know that there were 2 executive orders signed by George Bush Jr. before he left office about next-generation communication that's hovering over America?
Yeah, I can believe that, and there's a lot of unsealed presidential orders, and Obama's administration has not done enough, in my opinion, to undo any of it. In fact,
I agree with you.
Even amplified it, and those were promises not met and not pursued that need to be met, and that's, again, nobody gets a free ride. People need to hold people's feet to the fire, and now's the time because people are all feeling the pain. There isn't one of us in this country on one level, on one issue or another. I think the idea of the Tea Party movement, that concept, I think it's a great idea. I just wish it wasn't all dominated by conservatives, because I don't care whether you call yourself a conservative or a liberal. You need to engage this system because we're all being robbed of this republic. And that's the problem that I think is more pressing than all of these symptoms that we've been talking about.
I agree.
In terms of technology. And it's, we can activate within our own spheres of influence. Pressure is huge. I mean, I'd hate to be an incumbent from any party next session because I think they're all on their way out. Because unless someone comes up with solutions, nobody wants to hear any more rhetoric. Nobody wants to hear like the childlike name calling and looking for exotic issues to discredit people with. They want to hear about the solutions that are going to relieve the suffering that people are going through actually in the country outside of the Beltway.
I can't believe we're living at a time when there will be forced medical insurance and forced medical applications that we have to use, that we not only are not in harmony with, but that are totally antithetical to health, to wellness, to understanding the body electric. I mean, the body electric paradigm is so different from the get sick and get well paradigm based on sickness.
Absolutely.
It's unbelievable. And yet we're being forced or fined or jailed to buy insurance with companies and by a government that for using FDA people who deny the right for people to pursue their own health remedies.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, this is tyrannical. I never thought in my lifetime that I would see this.
Well, I think again, these are all reflections of a government out of control. Ultimately, the root of the problem is about that, and that's where I think a little bit of effort on a very small number of people starts to make a difference. And I think this next cycle, I think there will be a lot of lessons learned, but we've just seen the beginning of some rough times, and I think we have opportunities to change them, or I wouldn't be doing this work. And I think that's really what we all have to also keep in mind, is there are opportunities in all of this. We just have to continue to look for them and exercise them.
It's interesting how when you focus on the intent to do good or to bring something about or to have something manifest, and you bring the right spirit and the right energy to it, how that multiplied hundreds and millions of times, how it can change a society.
Absolutely. And I think all the small efforts, there are no small efforts, they're just efforts. And, it may be as simple as walking down the street and smiling at the person passing you who maybe was on their way to blow their brains out. And that one instant, maybe turn that around, and maybe that's the person that creates the next great breakthrough in energy science. You don't know what you do, so do something. There are no small things, and I think that's again gets back to this. You can. A lot of people fall this way, and I've seen it over the years. They fall into this fear pattern because of all the things that are happening that are obviously unnerving. These areas included, but I can say on the front lines of all that. There is every expectation that we can overcome the current situation, and it's up to us to do something, and that's really it. And I'm maybe a little more optimistic than some, but we've been around a long time, human beings. This isn't the end of the show. In fact, maybe it's just the beginning of the next one. And do something, and let's see this thing turn around. I think that's what we can look forward to.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking with Dr. Nick Begich, the co-author of Angels Don't Play This HAARP, Advances in Tesla Technology, also the author of Controlling the Human Mind, The Technologies of Political Control or Tools for Peak Performance, and many other books. You can reach him at earthpulse.com.
That's it.
And we want to thank you for being on It's Rainmaking Time. I look forward to talking with you in the future. Thank you for your upbeat take and your advanced paradigm for what we can do, even in the face of this great darkness and difficulty. And thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me. Take care.
Many blessings.